On March 8, 1965, two US Marine battalions landed at Da Nang with the limited role of defending the American airfield. Their role was expanded to active combat in April, with more Marines deployed to Phu Bai. But at midnight on June 30th, a strong Viet Cong force had crossed the river south of Da Nang and were heading for the Marines and the airfield perimeter. This channel's mission is to challenge the Vietnam orthodoxy. Much of what you know about the Vietnam War is either incomplete or false. Please consider supporting this channel and its mission through Patreon. The link is in the description. Midnight, June 30th, 1965, found Private First Class Ray Shelton on a hill west of the Da Nang airfield. His battalion, the 3rd of the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, had arrived off Da Nang on January 29th, loaded aboard the ships of 7th Fleet's Task Force 76. A week earlier, anti-government riots had rocked Saigon and the former imperial capital, Hue, and on the 27th, Premier Chan Van Huong was removed by the military. But when an interim government was formed, the crisis was at least temporarily ended, and on the 31st, 39 departed for Subic Bay. The battalion was held there on 72-hour reaction time to land in Vietnam, and by late February, as the political and military situation once again deteriorated, 39 was back off Da Nang aboard the ships of Task Force 76. This time, however, committed to the defence of the Da Nang airfield by President Johnson. On March 8th, amphibian tractors carried 39 from the South China Sea between the Hai Van Peninsula and Monkey Mountain to touch down on the beach shortly after 9 am. The LVTP behind him, Shelton strode through water foaming over his combat boots and trousers and onto Red Beach 2. Lowering the M14 rifle from his chest, he began to follow the Marines from the shoreline, startled to discover that instead of the Viet Cong, a line of pretty Vietnamese girls were waiting for the Marines, welcoming them with beaming smiles, garlands of flowers, and words that none of them could yet understand. While 19 defended the airfield perimeter, 39 had been positioned on the 268-327 hill mass, providing security for the airfield, and Battery B of the Light Anti-Aircraft Missile Battalion on Hill 327. Shelton, like most of the other Marine infantrymen, had at first suffered from the heat and humidity of South Vietnam, until General Koch, Assistant Division Commander of the 3rd Marine Division, had restricted defensive patrols and heavy work to the early morning and late afternoon. Now, his luminous watch face glowing midnight, Shelton lazily looked east from his position on Hill 268, past the city of Da Nang, squeezed up against the Da Nang River, and back towards the South China Sea. Unknown to Shelton and the Marines of 19, at that moment a Viet Cong Special Operations Company, reinforced by a 13-man North Vietnamese sapper team, had crossed the Cao Zo River south of the airfield, and the 85 men, armed with automatic weapons, grenades, demolition charges, one 57mm recoilless rifle, and four 81mm mortars, had reached the southeastern perimeter of the Da Nang airfield, while two rifle squads took up blocking positions to ambush any reaction force. The mortar company, supported by the recoilless rifle, divided into two sections. The first would fire on the helicopter parking area, while the second supported the sappers. At 01:15, the sapper team had tunnelled under the outer defensive wire, crossed the open ground to the inner perimeter, and cut a hole in the fence. The area the sappers had penetrated was patrolled by roving sentries from A and C companies of 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. The Marines were supported by MAF Logistics Support Group troops and ONTOS strong points equipped with 106mm recoilless rifles. A Marine sentry, hearing a suspicious noise near the fence at 01:30, tossed an illumination grenade, and as the grenade burst bright, the VC opened fire, 10 sappers dashing onto the airfield under cover of the concentrated fire and exploding grenades. Satchel charges were thrown on aircraft on the field, destroying a Convair F-102 and 2 C-130s, and damaging 2 F-102s and 1 C-130. 2 squads from Company C rushed to reinforce the sentries, but the sappers were already withdrawing. As the squads approached the southern fence, small arms fire wounded 2 of the Marines, and a 57mm round hit the top of a concrete bunker, wounding the guard inside. But the attackers did not escape unscathed. Blood trails were discovered leading from the airfield, and 50 minutes after the start of the attack, Marine artillery began firing on suspected routes of withdrawal. Company D and a platoon from Company B arrived to reinforce the defenders, while 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines, deployed along Route 1, blocking any attack from the west or northwest. Colonel Wheeler and Lieutenant Colonel Ludwig outlined a plan to find the retreating VC at 0300 hours. Company B, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, assisted by ARVN units, would sweep the northern bank of the Khao Zo, under operational control of the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, which would search the area to the south of the river. The mission was planned to start at first light, but the units were not in position until 0700 hours. 1 platoon from Company B patrolled the river in LVTs and remained ready as a mobile reserve, while the other platoons of the company deployed along the road north of the Phong Lay Bridge, 1.5 miles south of the airfield. When the operation ended at 1700 hours, the Marines returned with 14 suspects, none of whom proved to have been involved in the attack. The South Vietnamese, however, captured the intelligence officer of the sapper team, who identified his parent unit as the 3rd Battalion, 18th NVA Regiment. Damage to the airfield was not extensive, with few casualties, but the attack was widely publicised, and it renewed command attention to the vulnerability of US bases. General Westmoreland, Commerce V, had offered his opinion on the war on February 9, 1965. He believed the attack on Camp Holloway was an escalation, and though a previous request for American combat troops to protect US bases in South Vietnam had been rejected, Westmoreland asserted the question could no longer be ignored. Later that month, a group of senior generals, led by Major General Nguyen Van Thieu, 4 Corps Commander, and Air Vice Marshal Nguyen Cao Ky, Commander of the Air Force, deposed General Haïn as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Confronted with the deteriorating political and military situation, Westmoreland directed his deputy, Lieutenant General John L. Throckmorton, to determine the ground forces required for base security. Throckmorton recommended the deployment of a 3-battalion Marine Expeditionary Brigade to Da Nang, as Da Nang was of vital importance as a base for any air campaign against the north. But Westmoreland wanted to use the minimum of American troops and recommended landing 2 battalions, with the 3rd held aboard ship offshore. On February 22nd, General Westmoreland forwarded the request to Admiral Sharp, and Sharp informed the JCS that he agreed with Westmoreland's assessment. President Johnson made the decision to commit a 2-battalion Marine Expeditionary Brigade to the defence of Da Nang, and on February 25th, General Karch and members of his staff visited General Westmoreland to discuss plans for the Marine landing. The Department of State cabled Ambassador Taylor on February 25th. The Marines would be landed, and he was to secure the approval of the government of South Vietnam. The next day, Taylor met with Prime Minister Phan Quyet to discuss the proposed landing, and on March 1st he met General Nguyen Van Thieu and General Chan Van Min, Chairman of the Joint General Staff, to discuss details of the deployment of 9th MEB. No objections were raised to the proposal, but concern was expressed about the reaction of the Vietnamese, and they requested that American forces should enter Da Nang in the most inconspicuous way feasible. On March 3rd, Ambassador Taylor received a message from Assistant Secretary of Defence John T. McNaughton. The 9th MEB would not be landed at Da Nang. Instead, the 173rd Airborne Brigade would be deployed by air from Okinawa. With the support of Taylor, Westmoreland objected to the proposed change. The Marines were more self-sustaining, and there has been extensive planning, reconnaissance and logistics preparation over the years. The CG 9th MEB is presently in Da Nang finalising the details for landing the MEB forces in such a way as to cause minimum impact on the civilian populace. I recommend that the MEB be landed at Zanang as previously planned. The objections overruled, on March 7th the JCS sent the signal to land 2 of the 39 MEB's BLTs. General Karch and his staff completed the 9th MEB Operational Plan 37D-65 on February 26. The plan covered the amphibious landing of a BLT and the airlift of his 2nd Battalion from Okinawa to Zanang. A command post exercise was then conducted on Okinawa, and a 2-day map exercise was scheduled to start on March 2nd. However, the exercise, and a briefing for Lieutenant Colonel Herbert J. Bain, commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, who were due to be airlifted to Zanang, were cancelled when Karch received orders to proceed immediately to Zanang. Karch and 28 members of his staff boarded a Marine KC-130F, departing Okinawa at 2300 hours, and after picking up staff members of Navy Task Force 76 at Phu Bai Point, the group arrived in Zanang on the morning of the 3rd. MACV liaison officers met the group and escorted them to the airbase and landing beaches. The MEB staff then returned to Subic Bay. The following day, General Karch issued a warning order to BLT-39. BLT-39 had been off the coast of Zanang on amphibious shipping since early February, and it was now to administratively land the landing force. Lieutenant Colonel Charles E. McPartlin Jr., the BLT commander, was to land his battalion on Red Beach 2, north of the airbase and west of Zanang City. The battalion was then to move by truck along Route 1 to defensive positions at the airfield. General Karch returned to Zanang on March 6, joining Admiral Woolson on board the Mount McKinley, 10 miles off Zanang with the rest of the task force, and returning to the command ship that evening, Karch ordered the execution of Upplan 37D with H hour set for 0800 hours March 8th. Lieutenant Colonel McPartlin planned for Company I to land over the northern part of Red Beach 2 and Company K over the southern sector. The two companies were to secure the landing area and provide advance guard for movement to the airfield. Company M was designated Battalion Reserve. At 0545, Amphibious Task Force 76, the flagship Mount McKinley, attack transport USS Henrico, attack cargo ship USS Union, and amphibious transport dock USS Vancouver close to within 4,000 yards of the shore and anchored in the harbour. Weather conditions were moderate with an intermittent drizzle at 0600 hours when Admiral Woolson gave the order to land the landing force. Visibility was 5 miles, an 8-knot wind was blowing from the northwest, and waves were cresting from 2 to 4 feet near the shoreline, gently meeting the landing beach. However, in the transport area, swells reached 8 to 10 feet, which made it almost impossible to hold the nets for the debarking troops, and several of the line's mooring landing craft to their motherships snapped. When it became impossible to load small boats alongside at 0730, Admiral Woolson postponed H hour until 0900 hours, and at the same time, General Karch left the Mount McKinley for the airbase by helicopter. An hour later, additional shore party personnel arrived by plane from Okinawa to help clearing the beach. A high surf plan was put into effect, and loads planned for the smaller landing craft, LCVPs, were rescheduled for LCMs, larger and heavier landing craft. The first wave of assault troops landed on Red Beach 2 in 11 Marine Amphibian Tractors, LVTPs, 3 minutes late, and the fourth and final assault wave of 39 landed at 0918. A group of Vietnamese girls met the Marines on the beach with laser flowers, while General T, commander of 1st Corps Tactical Zone, and the mayor of Zanang welcomed General Karch. Vietnamese troops had secured the beachhead and the route to the airfield, and the first echelons of Company L moved out at 0945, children lining the road under banners in Vietnamese and English. Company L was followed by Company I, artillery attachments, and Company K formed the rear guard of the motor march. Company M remained as beach security for general unloading. On the morning of March 7th, Major General William R. Rip Collins, 3rd Marine Division Commander, requested the 315th Air Division to provide the transportation to move the unit to Vietnam, and on Okinawa, Lieutenant Colonel Bain and the first elements of his battalion were alerted to move from Camp Schwab to the air facility at Futima that night. The BLT was organised into assigned aircraft loads and moved from Futima to Nahar Air Base, and at 2200 hours, the movement orders were approved by the Air Force, with 30-minute intervals between launches of the C-130s. General Collins radioed McVie in Saigon shortly after midnight, requesting authority to start the airlift, with the first aircraft scheduled to arrive at Danang at 0900 hours on March 8th. His request was granted 6 hours later, but McVie later changed the arrival hour to noon. The first elements, consisting of the command group of the battalion and part of Company C, left Nahar Air Base at 0725. General Collins reported the move and stated that if he were allowed to expedite aircraft departures, the entire lift could take place during daylight. However, Major General Richard G. Stilwell, McVie Chief of Staff, called the SINCPAC Command Centre and explained that Danang could not accommodate 2 BLTs arriving at the same time. The lead elements of the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, arrived at the Danang Air Base about 1300 hours. Snipers fired at the aircraft without effect during their landing approach, and Companies C and B assembled in defensive positions on the western part of the airfield. Company D was already at Danang, protecting the Shufly helicopter unit, Marine Medium Helicopter Squadron 163, and reverted to parent control. The airlift was halted after the arrival of 13 aircraft, leaving only Company A on Okinawa. The helicopter carrier USS Princeton arrived off Danang just after sunrise on March 9th. Between 0700 and noon, HMM 365 transferred its 23 helicopters to HMM 162. The personnel of HMM 162, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver W. Curtis, arrived in Danang from Okinawa the same day on a Marine KC-130 aircraft. That afternoon, General Karch received permission from Westmoreland to resume the airlift of BLT-13. The first planes departed Okinawa shortly after midnight and arrived at Danang the next morning. The rest of the battalion landing team, with the exception of its attached tanks and low-priority vehicles, was in Vietnam by March 12, when the general unloading of the 9th MEB was also completed. Unloading was complicated by a lack of port facilities, and a firefight between the VC and Arvin 2 miles north of Red Beach on March 8th-9th. 1/3 of Marine ground forces and 2/3 of the Marine helicopter squadrons in the Western Pacific were now committed to South Vietnam. The Marine position in Vietnam was made clear in the Joint Chiefs of Staff landing order of March 7th. The US Marine Force will not, repeat will not, engage in day-to-day actions against the Viet Cong. General Westmoreland had given the 9th MEB the role of defending the Danang Air Base, but overall responsibility for the defence of Danang area remains an RVNAF responsibility. General Karch had 5,000 Marines under his command, the 2 infantry battalions, 2 helicopter squadrons, and limited logistic and combat support forces. The brigade absorbed Marine Unit Vietnam, Task Unit 7935, codenamed Shufly, which became Marine Aircraft Group 16 on March 9th. MAG 16 continued to support the Arvin throughout 1st Corps. Most flights were performed by HMM 163, but after becoming operational on March 12th, HMM 162 first supported the MEB, and by the end of March, both squadrons were supporting the Marines and the Arvin. The Marine pilots flew a mix of resupply and strike missions for the Arvin. The majority of the missions involved moving troops and cargo to outposts throughout 1st Corps, while strike missions required lifting company or battalion-size Arvin units in helicopter assault operations. On March 31st, the Marines flew helicopter support for Arvin Operation Quyet Thang 512, 17 UH-34Ds from HMM 163, 2 UH-34D SAR maintenance helicopters from HMM 162, and 7 US Army UH-1 gunships lifted 465 troops of the ARVN 5th Airborne Battalion from the Tam Kỳ area in Quang Tinh Province to a landing zone 25 miles south of Da Nang. The helicopters encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire approaching the landing zone, and in the first lift, First Lieutenant Wendell T. Eliasson was killed in the landing zone, his co-pilot, First Lieutenant Donald R. Wilson, flying the badly damaged UH-34D back to Da Nang. 4 other damaged helicopters were also forced to return. One of the Marine UH-34Ds was shot down. Its pilot, First Lieutenant Dale D. Eddy, was wounded in the neck and believed killed. His co-pilot, First Lieutenant James E. Magle, was also wounded, but made his way to another helicopter before he died. The wounded crew chief, Sergeant Cecil A. Garner, took his M60 machine gun and joined the fight on the ground. Another HMM-163 pilot, Major Benny H. Mann Jr., landed his helicopter under heavy enemy fire and rescued Eddy and Garner. Crew Chief Staff Sergeant Staniel J. Novotny lifting the conscious but paralysed Eddy from the downed helicopter. Mann would later be awarded the Navy Cross and Novotny the Silver Star. HMM-163 continued the lift until the entire battalion had been inserted. In addition to the Marine UH-34D, 2 Army UH-1s were shot down, 19 aircraft sustained battle damage, and the Marines suffered a total of 19 casualties, including the 2 killed, while 2 US Army personnel were hospitalised. Colonel Thomas J. O'Connor, 1st MAR Chief of Staff, later wrote that the VC were really moving into the Da Nang area in strength, and the situation was changing. The Marine Infantry battalions remained in the MEB's TAOR, 8 square miles of sparsely populated terrain which included the airfield and high ground to the west. Bain's 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, defended the airfield, and McPartland's 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, were forward on Hill Mass 268-327 due west of the airfield. 1-3 established listening posts forward of the command defensive areas around the airfield perimeter, but it was limited to establishing listening posts and conducting defensive reconnaissance patrols within that area. The battalion was prepared to support these posts with a reaction force which could be deployed rapidly. McPartland's battalion ran patrols west of the airfield but made no contact with the VC. The area to the east and south of the airbase continued to be the responsibility of the ARVN. General T wanted to keep the Marines from the populated area, concerned they might provoke incidents in the villages. With the MEB in place at Da Nang, General Westmoreland re-examined the American effort in Vietnam, and by March 26, he was prepared to provide Washington with a series of recommendations he had already forwarded to Admiral Sharp and the Joint Chiefs. The objective of his command was simple: to cause North Vietnam to cease its support of the Viet Cong and enable the survival of an anti-communist South Vietnam. He provided 3 alternatives to accomplish this goal. The US could provide more aid to the build-up of the Vietnamese armed forces, continue expanding airstrikes against the north, with the 7th Fleet interdicting infiltration by sea. But Westmoreland did not believe this would stabilise the Saigon government, and it would not assure the survival of South Vietnam. His second proposal was for the deployment of 5 divisions, including 3 American divisions, across Vietnam and the Laotian Panhandle near the 17th parallel, coordinated with increased air attacks against North Vietnam. The South Vietnamese armed forces would be strengthened, and other American and Free World troops would be dispatched to South Vietnam to deal with the Viet Cong insurgency. Westmoreland also discounted this option. He did not think port facilities and lines of communication could supply and support 5 divisions along the parallel in 1965, and he feared that the war would be lost before this capability could be established. Westmoreland believed only one feasible solution remained: continue the build-up of the ARVN, intensify the air war against North Vietnam, and land the equivalent of 2 US divisions, with the required combat and service support in South Vietnam. The American forces would have the aim of protecting vital US installations, defeating communist efforts to control Con Nun and Pleiku provinces, and the establishment of enclaves in the coastal region. General Westmoreland thought that total US reinforcement would consist of approximately 33,000 troops deployed by June. This would blunt the Communist offensive in the two northern core areas and stiffen South Vietnamese forces throughout the country. Ambassador Taylor, accompanied by Brigadier General William E. Dupuy, presented the estimate of the situation to the National Security Council in Washington on April 1st. At this meeting, President Johnson approved an 18,000 to 20,000 man increase in US logistic and support in Vietnam, the deployment of an additional 2 Marine battalions and 1 Marine air squadron to the Gia Nang Hue area. A change of mission for the 9th MEB was also permitted, which allowed for use of the Marines in active combat under conditions to be established and approved by the Secretary of Defense in consultation with the Secretary of State.